Hello. Good afternoon to Europe. Good morning to the US. Good evening to Asia. Welcome to our fourth HPE Health, Private Equity, M&A, and Life Sciences seminar organized by McDermott. My name is Stefan Rau. I've been partner with McDermott in the health and life science sector for 17 years. And it's an honor for me to introduce you to a panel of really distinguished health and life sciences experts. I will cite them in the alphabetical order, starting with Ben Faircloth, who has been also 17 years partner at LEK, where he heads the global health and life science practice. Ben Faircloth is truly European. We just discussed that before. Second, we have Karthik Cherama, and he has just joined TPG, where he's managing director and partner and head of the European health and life sciences practice. Before, he spent almost 20 years at Carlyle, where he was also managing director and partner and heading the health practice in Europe. And when I first met Karthik years ago in Germany, I was really impressed. He hadn't done, I think it was before his Schön acquisition. It was really impressing how much he knew about the German health market. And he was really able, in a very short conversation, to put the dots together in the context of political influence, stakeholder interests, money, and doctors' influences. And basically describe very well that the issues in healthcare obviously are always the same. Max Müller is our third panelist. He could be called the disruptor in German healthcare because he was one of the disruptors, because he was the CSO, meaning the corporate strategy officer of DocMorris, an online pharmacy, basically an online pharmacy located in the Netherlands to serve the German market, to challenge a system that was shaped by professional monopolism, or is still shaped by professional monopolism, meaning that a pharmacy must be owned by a pharmacist, by a very strict price regulation system, and by, at that time when DocMorris opened his business, online business was not possible. Max Müller and DocMorris really changed the market, also contrary to what local farmers said, the overall market share was obviously small. DocMorris was really able to introduce the mail order pharmacy business in Germany, and to also put some competition in price regulation, although a lot of those matters had to be decided by courts, usually by the ECJ. DocMorris was not always successful, but still persevered and, led to a great business story. A great business story is also, or a lot of great business stories can also be said about Ulrich Wandschneider. He was at Arthur Andersen and Deloitte for, I think, 17 years as a consultant. And then suddenly, or maybe for him not suddenly, not surprisingly, he became CEO of the then largest or second largest, or always changed, hospital group, health system in Germany, privately owned, meaning basically family owned. He stayed there as CEO for various years, became then chairman of the supervisory board, and now he kind of changed the branch. Now he's a senior consultant at a private equity fund at Trilantic. In addition thereto, he is supervisory board member, 1 out of 4 supervisory board members of BioNTech, a company which was maybe not that well known in Germany a few months ago, although it's a German company listed at NASDAQ, but is one of the 2 frontrunners here in, that at least what media say, I don't know what Ulrich is going to comment, frontrunners in developing a vaccine against COVID-19. And with that, I would like to ask the first questions to the audience related to this very broad topic. What influence have COVID-19 and related government measures had on the European health and life sciences markets, and in particular, obviously, the health and life sciences M&A markets? Max, do you want to start?
Thank you, Stefan. Well, it's a quite difficult question, and I have to say While I'm very grateful for your introduction, for the last 3 months, I've started a new chapter in my professional life and now work for one of the most innovative companies in pharma. I work for Bayer now, so you can't see the cross above and behind me, but this is now up in my heart. So I think one of the effects that we have seen in reactions to COVID-19 is really a boost in digital health. Whether it was related to lockdowns or to fast movements in that business, this is really have been a game changer for this development across across Europe, not to say the world. I think in the UK there is a very good example by Huma Medopad. You can see these contracts that they had with the NHS, whether in Scotland, in England, or in Wales, that really give remote patient monitoring a new meaning. And therefore we will see also these new developments in digital health becoming more and more attractive as people related to this crisis had a faster access to that, and also government understood that maybe some of their regulations needed to be adjusted. Second part, I think what is going to be an outcome of this crisis is that we have a new vision on innovative medication, whether it's biopharmaceuticals or for that matter, innovative approaches that maybe have not such a large impact. So we understood that dependencies on imports and APIs is a question that needs to be discussed with. Some of the reactions, though, are a bit worrisome. Global supply chains have worked in this crisis. I think we can fairly say that. So there is these two developments that we would cautiously see, and then we have a new approach on vaccines. So what we will see is whether the methods of, Ulrich Banschneider will probably say much more on the mRNA approaches to that matter, but nevertheless, we see that governments have now a different point of view in working together on investing in that sector, speeding up approvals. I think this is going to be vital and a very important development coming out of that. And then, yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic that the new role of science and the new way of looking at medicine and pharmaceuticals as a whole will give this sector the use and the value it has lost over the last years, where we just talked about cost but not the value.
Karthik, at your new fund that you just joined, what are you looking at?
So I think it's about as interesting a time in my last 20 years investing that I could have moved to a new platform. But having said that, I think following up from what Max was saying, largely consistent views. I think what we've seen through this pandemic is 4 themes, 2 of which Max already touched on. First is the telehealth and any kind of remote administration of care. I'd say a lot of the businesses we have, and including one that we actually recently invested in the US in behavioral health, there has been an acceleration of the provision of care through telehealth services of a variety of means. And I'd say there's probably been maybe an acceleration of 2+ years into the last 2 months. So ordinarily, if your business plan was calling for X number of cases, and you've seen a significant acceleration in the telehealth side. That's number one. Secondly, Max is absolutely right. Supply chains have largely held up, but I think there have been some disruptions in localized manners, and also governments are rethinking about how supply chains should be reoriented. And I think we're going to see some vigorous conversation on that front as well, both in the political arena and also in corporate boardrooms, as well as we think about where we want to place our supply chains. That's the second. If I can add a third and fourth element to it, the third one also is on the life sciences side. I do think that people are beginning to focus a lot more on innovation and the speed of innovation and how innovation is brought to market. So, one of the silver linings out of what is undoubtedly a human tragedy that hopefully none of us will have to live through again, has been that some of the science has come to the forefront and has gotten increased focus. And I think the question will be, how can we keep that, and how can we continue to reward innovation, both by simplifying the process by which it's brought there, and also by how we value innovation. I think that's the third element of it. And the fourth element of it, frankly, is just the provision. I mean, frontline workers, doctors, nurses who've done a call of duty above and beyond anything that they probably imagined in their lifetimes. We're going to have to rethink how we reward them, how we think about working with them in the future, in our hospitals, in our care homes. And the government is also going to have to play an active role, because they have, a lot of governments have provided support to a variety of provider support programs, and we need to do what will happen when those programs are lifted. So those are sort of the four elements that we're thinking about a lot at the moment, and what impact it has on the businesses.
Thank you, Karthik. Ben, is that also what you hear from your clients?
Hi, Stefan. Yeah, there's a lot of similarity in those themes, I think. Maybe to build on them, I think to the healthcare service side of things, so clinic-based businesses, there have been some quite unusual outcomes, I guess, depending on which segment you're in, which country you're in. Clearly, a lot of clinics have had to close or reduce their operations. And I think from an investment perspective, that means for a number of people this year may just be put to one side effectively, and holding periods will go out, certainly for private equity owners of some of those businesses. But you have some unexpected beneficiaries as well of some of the government programs. NHS funded dentistry in the UK, for example, which has rarely been in the spotlight positively in recent years because of a general lack of growth, has performed fantastically because people have been paid by the government to keep the capacity in place. So there's been a real switch around of fortune, and by contrast, private dentistry in the UK has been running close to fully closed, so effectively at zero capacity. Germany, dentists have been running at 50%. And I think that has big implications for the ramp-up speed, the amount of unmet demand that has to be served by clinics as they reopen. We see opportunities for the stronger providers coming out of the lockdown processes that have existed in most of Europe and are being gradually and tentatively unwound, to seek to address the pent-up demand and use that as a mechanism of both addressing the genuine healthcare challenge and access problem that has existed, and also, of course, address their own financial needs in many cases. But we also think there's an opportunity for incremental M&A in some of those businesses as well. We see some of the perhaps older owner-manager practitioners coming out of this first element of the pandemic and maybe deciding that now is a good time to bring forward retirement plans by a year or two. So we think there'll probably be some incremental M&A opportunities for some of the stronger platforms in some of the more fragmented provision markets across Europe. So some really differential outcomes during this period in clinic-based businesses. Just briefly on the life science side, I'd agree with the observations around regulators. I think will want to try and embed some of the lessons learned from this process around accelerating the clinical trial process, taking out some of the cost of the clinical trial process, and that will be to the advantage of e-clinical players in our view, so businesses that have technology that address the clinical trial process. And those have been seeing very significant demand, as I think has been touched on by previous speakers. So, as Karthik said, it's a very difficult time on many levels, not first and foremost the human level. But when you look at it through the lens of investments, some great challenges for businesses as they work through this, but some opportunities as well.
When you speak about accelerating clinical trials, it was obviously particularly intended in connection to everything related to COVID-19. Did that have a negative impact on other drugs or products?
Yeah, it did. I think if you take the pharma contract service space more broadly, and you can see this in publicly recorded information, clearly the large CROs who are running the clinical trials, most of them saw quite a significant slowdown in activity because the trial sites, so the GP clinics, the hospital sites, the academic sites were inaccessible or closed. So there has been a slowdown in trial activity, other than for trials obviously linked to COVID-related therapeutics and to potential vaccines. Those have been somewhat accelerated. But I think what you've seen as a result of the access problems for the trial sites is a move towards regulators being more positive around technologies that encourage virtual interaction. So there is a gradual, it's still rather vague, but gradually emerging concept of the virtual clinical trial. And some elements of that are getting a real boost through these access restrictions on physical trial locations. And I think that will likely be embedded in regulatory protocols coming out of the other side of the crisis. But yes, certainly there's been some slowdown. I think those are largely, those physical trial sites are reopening, the trials are starting to move again. So it will work its way through the system, but there have definitely been some slowdowns, yeah.
Thank you. Ulrich, with your broad perspective coming from hospitals, being in the vaccine at the front of the vaccine production, as it appears, also being a supervisory board member of reusable med devices, what's your view?
Thank you. Well, actually, nobody has been prepared on a virus like this, and even if there has been certain scenarios made over the last couple of years in various countries and by various companies, nobody has been really prepared, and so therefore the virus came over to Europe as a shock to the countries, to the providers, and to the whole industry. Doesn't matter which area. And if you look where we are standing now, we are still working on it and to digest it and to develop strategies against the virus. Various countries with different approaches, various industries with different approaches. And if you look on pharma healthcare, you see that certain areas are very much infected and others are less. From the overall view, I must say that since this industry in general is also part of the solution, probably, we will come out sooner than other areas, and we won't have so seriously issues and problems like other industries in the like automotive or also in the retailer business. We will have scenarios where we can get out of the situation. I think it's very impressive how the various governments are approaching the situation. Some with more success and luck than others. But generally speaking, one can say that every country, every industry, every player actually in the pharmaceutical and biomedical industry is really trying to give it their best to develop approaches against COVID-19. And so it's very interesting to see how the approvals are getting, approval speed is getting increased, how clinical trials can be agreed on. So for example, in Germany, I can say that the Paul-Ehrlich Institute and together with Roland Koch Institute and others are really very much focused on helping to develop medicine against or vaccine against COVID-19. So that is very, very impressive. And on the other side, also like Ben already mentioned, in other areas, we of course have difficulties in executing clinical trials since there are no patients on that area because hospitals and university hospitals are not able to execute the trials in the proper way as they would like to do. in all other areas. So therefore, there of course also tremendous. This has also tremendous impact on the industries itself. But as mentioned in the beginning, since nobody was prepared, it's very impressive how science, how business, how governments are working together to find ways out of the situation. And the way out of the situation is actually what I believe is the most important thing now. So in terms of saying, I don't get back to sleep. People are very motivated on one side, but being in the home office for 3 months, this really slows down industries and companies. And whatever happens without any risks, we need to get people inspired to really go back to their work and to do something to develop industries, to develop clinical trials, to develop services on patients.
Thank you, Ulrich. I mean, as you said, no one could have foreseen this pandemic, and a lot of probably really successful government measures were taken. But if this were to start again, what would you recommend to change? Or which government measures do you think were particularly productive and good, and which maybe not so much?
Well, I hope that nothing like this will come up soon again. So I'm sure that what we experienced so far will last for a couple of months and years before it really will be will be safe again. This will just take long month, many months, and probably many years, because it's very expensive and very difficult regarding the logistics to develop proper vaccines, and also to implement that and treat all the potential inhabitants of the world. So we are talking about billions, and this will take its time. From my side, I can say in Germany, it was quite well reaction so far. We have been experienced support in general on all industries, especially in the healthcare industry, in the hospitals. There was an additional fee besides the Kurzarbeit issues. The hospitals got money. If they are in the Krankenhausplan, they got money and have been able to overcome certain difficulties. Nursing homes are still occupied, and they are quite busy so far. And the outpatients area, like it was mentioned before, especially dentists, of course, have had tremendous problems. But I don't see that it would be easy to do it differently if a second virus comparable to this one will occur. So from my point of view, it was quite, I see it quite positive what the German government did within the reactions, and including also the investments, the support of industry, also developing COVID-19 vaccines and things. I think that's a very positive reaction, and I see this also in some of the countries. So I wouldn't, from the point of view that you don't know.
Okay, Max,
it was a positive thing.
Max, is that also you, or to put it differently, you are in charge of regular affairs, political affairs for Bayer in Germany and the EU. What would be your message to European governments, or your request, or your wish?
Well, I think, well, to some extent I agree, but to some extent I would also, and this is what we're doing, is to make very clear that we have to listen and learn from this pandemic. And in the beginning, and Chancellor Merkel made this clear herself, that some of the lockdowns of the internal markets, closing down borders and not sharing the use of goods, was clearly a mistake. And I think governments have learned from that they have in such situations to share rather than to shut down, as it has a negative impact on the supply chains. I think this is one of the first learnings that we will see in in the near future. We can also see that governments have reacted first with the group of four, and now with the Commission dealing with competitors of ours when it goes to purchasing potential options on vaccines. It is clear that we understood that we can solve such a crisis in an internal market only together and not on a national level. Thirdly, we do believe that it is now, in the fullness of time, deeply necessary that we have to improve our capabilities on digital health. We need to have a data strategy and an outreach for that matter when it comes to the use. We all had debates prior to COVID-19 about HTA, which is now being Corona-related, delayed probably to next year. But the regulatory acceptance for real-world evidence has clearly been seen in this pandemic. So we do believe these are vital points. I think what was a good example, also done by the German government, is to understand that sometimes industry can act faster and to a larger extent better than in a purely governmental approach. Germany has put together a task force of expertise with SAP, with Bayer, with BASF and others to say, can you help us getting access to masks, to products that came mainly from China, but also with the quality control. The German chemical industry put together in no time a platform to produce disinfectants. So it clearly showed that even though we were not prepared for such a dimension, we have learned fast, unfortunately the hard way, with so many human losses all across the continent. But I think we will now be much better prepared. Now, one thing, just to finish this up, which I think is important, is sometimes in such situation, people say, okay, let's start, for instance, stockpiling medications or stockpiling other products. We believe this is probably the wrong answer. We need to have a serious debate on how to make best use, so we do not run on the one hand side in shortages of medications, but on the other side, we need to leave room open for investments and for capital to be moved. Having this stockpiled somewhere in storages, maybe run by the government, will have a harmful impact on businesses. So far, I think cooperation with governments has been very, very fruitful. We expect in the new in the new program from the Commission with EU for Health, a careful but well thought strategy coming up in Q4, and I think it will put Europe back on the map again when it comes to developments of new products. So I think this is all good. I also believe, and this I beg to differ a little, that we have to get used, not maybe a pandemic of this proportion, but as we are seeing some positive events of economies coming back step by step and slowly, we have to be cautious. There's still no vaccine, there's still no medication, and be cautious when it comes to a second wave. So there's still a lot of things to do and to be done also for the government. So yeah, we're cautiously optimistic, but there's still a lot of things to do.
Thank you, Max. And I introduced you as a true European from the island. Do you want to give an overview of what you think how European states compare to each other, and also how Europe overall compares to South Korea and Japan? I mean, Germany, we think most things went quite well and mortality rates were relatively low, but compared to South Korea and Japan, they are really high. What's your view?
Yeah, I can certainly start on the European side. I think it is a bit inevitable, I think, to contrast the different healthcare systems' performance during this crisis. It can be a bit macabre, obviously, given what we're talking about. Differences in the way the data is recorded, the way the data is refined, can make direct comparisons a bit difficult. But I think enough has happened now that we can observe some countries have clearly performed better, thus far at least, than others. And if you take certainly the UK, France, and Germany, the markets I'm personally closest to, it's pretty clear that the performance is in that order, ascending, as it were. So Germany has clearly handled the crisis and the pandemic better than France, and certainly better than the UK. I think there are lots of reasons for that. I think a couple of the really key ones is, as a country, the system is inherently better configured to coordinate national level requirements with local level, so national policies with state level policies with local implementation. So there is a system in place that works better. I think the centralized systems of certainly England and France have proved somewhat more wanting in that regard. There was a lot more testing capacity right up front in Germany, and that was backed up by the track and trace capability as well of the country, both of which were deployed incredibly effectively. I mean, I can remember being very impressed early on in this pandemic when in Germany it was being widely reported that people were coming back from Austria from skiing, and they were being tracked as to where they were going, and it was obvious there'd been a major outbreak and a major infection cluster in Ischgl in Austria. Around the same time that the UK government was pretty much having to abandon a track and trace program because there wasn't the capacity to test enough people to make it viable. And that contrast, I think, tells you a lot about how things subsequently played out, because what's also evident is you really set your course on these things very early on. And the mistakes you make in the first few weeks really do determine a lot of the outcome. It's very hard to come back from some of those. I think the PPE acquisitions, so procurement of personal protective equipment, has been challenging in all three countries, but again, probably better handled in Germany than in France, where it's been very, very problematic, or the UK, where it's also been problematic. We've seen and conducted some surveys, we've seen others that show the French clinicians have been, particularly in the public sector, have felt very let down by the government and by the support they've received. And it's interesting, you compare across the three countries, the French clinicians are the most frustrated, actually, even though objectively you would observe that certainly in the UK, again, the results here have been very difficult and challenging, and clinicians here have obviously also had a very difficult time with similar kind of challenges. I think in France, the national control system, when it got to the regions, had some problems. We saw burdened systems in Paris and in the eastern region of France on the German border. Going back to Max's point, it was disappointing at that point that rather than people crossing the border to use free capacity, there's a lot of free capacity as well in ICU beds in Germany, we should remember. The free capacity in southwest Germany could have been leveraged. Instead, the French authorities were taking people on TGVs, you may remember those images, to other parts of France where they had spare capacity. So a lost opportunity for cross-border collaboration at the height of the crisis, sadly. And then in the UK, very unfortunately, obviously, very, very sad for any of us living here. It has been a very difficult crisis, very poor coordination at all levels of government with all major institutions, I would suggest, and lack of capacity in track and trace and testing, PPE challenges, procurement challenges. So unfortunately, these things all add up. It's no one thing that drives it. I would just go back to, you were asking earlier about what would you like to see done differently or changed. I think two things for me. I really hope that those countries that have had a harder time, and obviously speaking as a UK citizen, the UK foremost among them, that we really do have a proper inquiry to learn from the mistakes and then we do something about it. Secondly, I really hope that countries learn from each other. I've been a bit disappointed, frankly, at how slow it appears to me that countries have learned from the experiences of other countries, and that goes for everything really, clinical best practice through to public health policy management. And so to your point about Asia, I'm not close enough to the Japanese or South Korean markets to be clear on quite why they've been so successful. But I would observe they have a much longer heritage in Southeast Asia in particular, and in Korea, of dealing with pandemics. I think they clearly have systems that are better geared up for this. This wasn't the first time in recent memory they've had to run cluster outbreak management programs, track and trace programs. They have leveraged digital technology, certainly South Korea, better than most other countries, certainly in Europe to date. And I think the cultural factor is important. I think the societies have been, and the citizens are better trained, probably better behaved, if I can use the word. They just know how to behave in a way to try and reduce some of their infection risk. So I think I'm sure there are a lot of other reasons why they've been successful I'm not close to, but I think for the different outcomes in Europe, it's been a range of factors, but fundamentally you can see some pretty common themes around coordination, testing capability, and the ability to manage outbreaks when you find them as being pretty consistent, and PPE procurement.
Thank you. Karthik, do you want to comment there on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was pretty well covered. I mean, the way I would approach it for the different person maybe is, I think there is a socio-political, economic context to all of this, which may explain some of the differences in ways the government have been able to respond, right? I mean, there's an element of politics involved, there's an element of how the socioeconomics within the country are organized, and also, just politically what can be feasible. So I think that has been something we're going to have to re-examine and say, hey, how are we actually going to coordinate and communicate through this if, God forbid, it happens again? The second thing is the point on the communication and coordination, whether it is within country or across borders. I think that's something, which has been, most of us have been underwhelmed, and I think there's only room for improvement on that front. I think the third question, I think we touched on it in a couple of different places, is structurally, where do we invest in now, right? What was if you look at it, what was the missing pieces? What were the gaps? Physician capacity, ICU capacity, PPE, etc. How do we invest to make sure that we're not, overstocking just for the sake of stocking it up and putting it in a warehouse somewhere and letting it, that's locked up capital, frankly, that a lot of governments may not be able to afford. But how do we actually make sure we have the necessary structural investments made so that we can actually respond to it if it happens again? I think that's a big element of what governments will have to, if they really want to make a difference, God forbid if it happens next time around. I think that's where they're going to have to. Having said all of that, I think somebody else was saying, we're not out of this yet. I mean, it's too early to have this in the rear view mirror. This is still a very present problem, whether and as we've learned this is a global problem. This is not a localized problem. So it does spread globally. So we're not out of the woods. I mean, cases are still ramping up in places like India, Brazil, and places like that. So I think we need to keep a close eye and continue to learn real time, because this is by no measure in the rearview mirror yet.
Thank you. Ulrich, you're agreeing. When we refer to what Ben was saying, that obviously quite nice for us as Germans that it worked quite well here in Germany, but the unnice message was that we had empty hospital beds and people in Eastern France did not come to Germany. Do you think that the governments will take measures to improve that? Basically also to reduce national egoisms and be prepared to help each other more? I see tendencies there, but I don't know whether this would really work under those pressures that we had some months ago.
I think it's not just a matter of national egoism. It's more just the unexperiencedness with such a situation in the various areas, various countries, and also various segments. So everybody tries to do something as best as he knows and as he believes or she believes, and then you look around. In the beginning of the situation, Germany helped very much with equipment, which later on was missing. So the key point is not whether Germany or somebody else has enough equipment. The question is, generally speaking, what can the country or what can Europe do in those cases when equipment is missing and might get problems. So the logistics of medical services, generally the logistics of masks, of vaccine, other treatment equipment needs to be rethought, and I think that this will be something where the countries could work much better together. On the other side, we have been quite much informed by newspapers from where the patients have been flown in, like Italy, like France. So things have been working, but of course it sounds very weird if you have a border all of a sudden, which we hadn't for more than 20, 30 years. And all of a sudden in areas like between Germany and Austria, there were cities with a bridge between each other, and they were not allowed to visit the other side. So that was, of course, very strange and not helpful. And on the other side, we have a similar situation currently. We had it in Gütersloh or other areas. So you have to make decisions in certain moments, and this was done by best known knowledge, by best knowledge, and so it happened that way. In other countries, I'm sure it was the same. The only question is how you can really overcome the situation of the artificial barriers between countries, and also to look at regions like in the area between Cologne and Netherlands and Belgium, or between Switzerland and Germany, and Austria and Germany as well. So this will be something which should be more in the focus, but I think in most cases this has to do with traditional service experience with traditional systems, healthcare systems. As you know, healthcare is still next to the taxation. Is healthcare just a topic of the individual country, and it's really not aligned at all. Even the education of doctors, yes, is more or less aligned, but if you look on reimbursement, if you look on structure and other things, it's absolutely not aligned. The only thing then again is the development of drugs and things like that. This is more or less similar, same, and the same thing for medical device industry. But the provider business is very local, it's very national, and it's actually not only national, it's also very local. If you look at Italy in the south, it's on one side the same system than in the north, but on the other side it's managed by regions, and this is very difficult to overcome if it's lacking in the concept itself.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I think Ulrich's last point on how localized our current healthcare delivery systems are is, I think, something incredibly topical, just because of the examples that were cited before. But even structurally speaking, the question that's going to come out of it, whether even when we hopefully get past this COVID environment, is that the system under which we will continue to operate, or will we begin to try to better coordinate our various healthcare systems? Especially, we have public systems, private systems. Even between public systems, they break differently between ambulatory businesses, between inpatient businesses. I mean, it is an absolute. It's classic. I'd say it's a horse designed by a committee. So it ends up looking like a camel, maybe. But it is this patchwork of healthcare systems needs to coordinate better going forward, because we do have a combined monetary policy for the most part. We have a common currency. We have open borders, movement of people. But the one thing we don't have an approach on health. to think about it. But I think next to taxation, it's probably and education, it's probably one of the most complex topics to address from a European project point of view.
I didn't want to mention Brexit, but in that context,
I want to feed all the questions to Ben in that case.
Do you think, no, honestly, I mean, I was mentioning national egoisms before, and obviously also I assume that in each country there are politicians who will maybe appear more reasonable than others, who might appear more egoistic and always want to be the front runners as opposed to their local co-governors. We have that in Germany. But do you think that COVID-19 has an impact on the public opinion as to Brexit in the UK? Well, a question to Ben and Karthik. And if so, into which direction? Or maybe to add on, in the US, one had the impression that at least when COVID-19 started, national egoism accelerated, and it was the COVID was considered to be the Chinese virus, which was difficult for Chinese people there. I mean, racism clearly accelerated. But to put that on a softer level, I mean, on a more reasonable level, do you see some impact or not really?
I think, personally, I don't see a particularly direct link with Brexit. I mean, yeah, the Brexit vote was a long time ago now, even if we still are working through what exactly it means to have fully left the transition agreement period. So my personal view is I don't think there's a big link at a sort of population level, other than clearly not knowing exactly what the nature of our economic and trading relationship is going to be with the EU, let alone our relationship with a number of health bodies and other bodies, is just another piece of uncertainty as we head into what is clearly a difficult economic environment for all countries. And it does broadly seem that at least the recovery, the speed of recovery, is probably linked, at least near term, to how well managed the pandemic was to start with, and also how rigid and rigorous the lockdown then was. And I think there probably is a correlation between governments globally that are viewed as more populist, as having lockdowns that have been on the lighter side generally, and probably the somewhat faster to release in some cases, and therefore where perhaps we will see more challenges in terms of that path back to wherever we end up as being normal in the phase after this part of the pandemic experience. So I wouldn't say there's a particular link to Brexit per se in my mind, but I do certainly look at the back end of this year and the near-term uncertainty that the continued negotiation process is adding into the economic mix as being extremely unhelpful in the broader terms of the broader UK economic recovery. Okay.
I just sent a message to everyone attending. If you want to ask questions to the panelists, please use the chat or the Q&A sessions, whatever you want, and I would ask them to the panelists or individual panelists that you might select. Nothing. So, Karthik, I want to come back to the initial question. You are at a PE fund. You have to make investments. What do you think will you be focusing on most in the next 2 years?
Good question, and I approach it in two ways. One is,
of course, you wouldn't disclose us everything. I know that.
So I think the question is, did this COVID change the way we look at the way we would approach investments, right? And the first thing is we have to separate out some of the temporary effects of what we're going through, and we have to remember to isolate that in making any investment decisions right now. And that plays itself out in a number of different ways, whether there is a level of support for provider businesses, whether businesses which have more private exposure, whether it's things like dentistry in the UK or outpatient centers in Germany, which have been more adversely impacted, whether whatever we're going through, you have to isolate what's temporary, what's been the temporary influence over there and take that out of the equation. Or at least you need to have an understanding and an expectation of what that recovery would look like, whether it's U-shaped, V-shaped, etc. The second thing then is where do we then look forward to making those investments? I think the story hasn't changed too much in my opinion, which is I think we will continue to invest in provider businesses where we're able to deliver good clinical outcomes in an efficient manner. I think the drive and the strive for efficiency is going to remain in the system, maybe accelerated by some of the things we need to pay for.
In any segments.
So whether it's shifting greater from inpatient to outpatient settings, shifting even from outpatient to telehealth settings, those type of dynamics I think get accelerated, and I think we have to find the right setting for the right type of care, and I think we will accelerate that trend, which I think has already been happening for a while in Europe. The second thing is I think on innovation, I think we're going to have to value innovation more appropriately and pay for it more appropriately. Which products are true differentiated products? How do we price it? How do we make sure that there is an adequate return on R&D? So that currently there is this great interest in R&D. In if you have a COVID vaccine, everybody is running to invest in it and develop it. But we need to find a way to sustain that into other areas as well. And so we need to create a system where that innovation is valued. And I think we will continue to look for investments where you're sure that you're going to capture that value as opposed to playing the cost game on the life sciences businesses. So I think that's going to be there. Not to say, there aren't going to be things where leading through cost is going to make a difference. Whether you're doing mail order pharmacies to deliver medicines at a cheaper cost, or whether you're distributing at a cheaper cost, I think those things are going to stay important as well. But that's the way we've been looking at it at the moment.
And are you looking at particularly countries or regions more than others? We're speaking about the nationalization of production chains, localization of production chains. Max was saying global production chains had actually worked, governments take another view.
Yeah, I think we've always taken a very pan-European approach to things, starting here in the UK and also looking at most of, I'd say, Western Europe, which is where I spend most of my time. And I think it's going to differ country by country, so it's hard to draw those generalizations because every country needs a particular set of solutions, and we have to make sure we get down to the second layer. Otherwise, it's what I call a big question, but it's a slightly more nuanced answer for each country.
Max?
Yeah, I'd like to maybe follow up on what Kar said. I think one of the problems that we have is that in this time of COVID-19, we had a small window in which we had a general understanding of thinking together, acting together. After our first impression was and first reaction was rather to, trying to keep everything for us. I do want to pour some water into the wine. I do not believe that we will have a European approach on the healthcare systems.
Why?
I think to some extent there will be a shift to more European approaches. For instance, on some of the topics that are regulatory issues, such as authorizations or stuff like that, strengthening EMA, for instance. But I do believe that if we look at the resilience of the systems, it is very, very differently, starting with the way of how we fund healthcare systems, taxes versus insurance-based systems, etc. I'm not sure whether this works to really have a complete European approach. What I do believe, though, is that the facilitators that we have seen at the moment. So we are an aging continent. We have a lack of doctors in some of the European states, and actually are trying to move away doctors from one member state to another in order to overcome this topic. How can we deal with such situations? The use of telemedicine, of telepharmacy, of data use will soften this burden, but I am not overly confident that once we have overcome this particular crisis, we will fall back into our old habits. So I think when we look into the developments of the business, it is our responsibility as industry to make sure that the lessons learned will be remaining in the focus. So as I mentioned, global supply chains actually work. What we are seeing is a debate to find easy answers on complex issues. Now, it gets you applause if you say, okay, we will bring all pharmaceutical production back to Europe. But let's face facts here. I mean, even if we would do that from a political perspective across Europe, how long would it take us? What is about granting the permissions? How do we interact with third countries such as the Americas or Asia for that matter when it comes to these topics? We have to emphasize ways that where a difference is really useful. So a European CDC is clearly something that is going to be helpful in coordinating. I think this is the strength that we can see in coordination. We do not have a lack of funding. I think this is the good thing. And some of the companies that were just known to experts now are easing up developments on gene therapy, on cell and gene editing and innovations that people have now new hope in it and discuss it much more. So I think this is something we can work on. But I'm afraid I'm already hearing, yeah, we did this better than others, so let's move away a bit from that direction. I hope this is not going to happen, but I see already first movements in that direction to say we did good, others did bad, so let's focus on our way again.
Well, that was not supposed to be the message here, which is why I was.
I know.
Which is why I was referring to South Korea, because of course in Germany we have the kind of tendency of saying, well, we are better, we did it better than others. If you look at South Korea and Japan, because we can really say we did it quite badly. But maybe Ulrich, as a major representative of the German health industry, do you have some final remarks on this?
National egoism, no, forget it. No, I agree very much with Max. It's we should not throw the ball to the neighbor and shout at him. But it's more something. It's a learning which actually nobody wanted to experience, but now it's there, and we need to do the best out of it. And this is something which we have to do not only on a national base, but of course on a European base. The various healthcare payment systems itself should not be a barrier, but they are currently in certain situations. But the willingness of governments, the willingness of scientists, the willingness of companies, also in our pre-discussion with Max, showed that everybody is trying to work together and learn out of this situation. And I think that's actually the most important thing. And it's actually strengthening Europe as itself. And the collaboration of the various countries much more than people could believe in a couple of months ago. And so therefore I'm positive on this part of learning, and I really hope that which company ever finds a vaccine against the virus, this will happen soon and not later. And as you know, there are various companies believing that they can produce vaccine doses already this year in more than 100 doses. Thank you very
That
much
was
so
a
much.
clear, non-egoistic remark, leaving it open which company will be the first developer of a vaccine. Thank you for this. It's 5 o'clock European time, Central European time. Thank you all, your panelists, for this. I found great discussion. Thank you all attendees who stayed until the end. Yeah, I wish you all a great day and hope to speak to each of you soon. Again, bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Take care.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.